Okay, this morning we're going to begin back with the Roman prefects. We've looked at their duties or their responsibilities. They had the right and the privilege and the responsibility to collect taxes, to extend the judicial arm, and to command military forces. We spent most of our time on the third of those, their right to command military forces in Palestine, because that brought us into a breakdown of the divisions of the Roman army. Now what we're going to do will be to begin looking at the Roman prefects individually. There were 14 prefects who ruled Palestine from Caesarea prior to the fall of the nation and the city, Jerusalem and Judea, from AD 66 to AD 70. We saw their duties last time. Now we begin looking at the men. There are 14 of them, from AD 6 to AD 66. Hope 3 6s don't bother you. AD 6, of course, is the time whenever Archelaus is banished and Rome takes over Judea and turns it into an imperial province. So the Roman prefects, later they are known as the procurators, the whole time in general they can be referred to as governors, are in control from their headquarters, their base in Herod's palace at Caesarea, from then until the fall of the city in AD 66 to AD 70. We stop with 66 because we have a fall apart of the nation there, and the city finally capitulates in AD 70. 14 of these, thankfully, we're not going to have to deal with all of them. Only 3 of them are of importance. 3 of them are of importance with regard to New Testament narratives and accounts, so those will be the only ones at which we look. They were never counted as the best people. Trajan called them the spleen of the empire. Vespasian referred to them as those sponges. Why a sponge? Because they soaked up too much money in the taxation process. They were supposed to tax fairly, lawfully, legitimately, and turn the taxes over directly to the Roman Empire, to the emperor in Rome. But of course they, like so many others, would take up a little extra tax money and pocket the extra amount. So Vespasian referred to them as those sponges because they soaked up money. In the Bible, in the book of Acts, Lysias, Tertullus, and Paul referred to the current prefects under the phrases most excellent and most noble. So since I've just said that Trajan called them the spleen of the empire and Vespasian spoke of them as those sponges, we'll have to explain why in Acts do Lysias, Tertullus, and Paul speak of them under the phrases most excellent and most noble. Well, with the first 2 men, Claudius Lysias, who was the captain of the cohort in Jerusalem, and Tertullus, who was the orator, remember, brought down to argue against Paul, they probably do it just to flatter the current Roman prefect in Caesarea. Lysias refers to the current Roman prefect as most excellent in Acts 23:26. In Acts 23:26, Lysias refers to him as most excellent. Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, I send my greetings. Most excellent prefect, but governor is a general term which is allowed. Claudius Lysias is writing a letter and he says, I'm addressing it unto the most excellent governor Felix. Well, he probably does that for no other reasons but to flatter, because they were thought of as sponges and spleens, not as most excellent individuals. In Acts chapter 24 and verse 3, Tertullus refers to the current man as most noble. We accept it always and in all places, Acts 24:3, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Well, he, like Lysias, probably is attempting to flatter Felix. Paul, however, in the final case, in Acts 26:25, Now we move beyond Felix to Festus, refers to Festus as most noble. But Paul's not one who tries to flatter people to get by in current situations. Probably Paul has respect for his God-ordained and God-given authority and position. And therefore, in the eyes of a Christian, it is not you spleen or you sponge, it is you most noble prefect, you most noble governor, because of what Paul writes in Romans chapter 13. That's in Acts 26:25. He said, I am not mad, most noble Festus. Well, he's not really most noble. I mean, if we want to know the literal truth about the man, he's not most noble. He's not just trying to flatter him, as Claudius Lysias and Tertullus tried to do to Felix before. But he probably has high regards for the man's God-given and God-ordained place and right of rule and authority in government. I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak forth the words of truth and sound-mindedness. 3 of these 14 Roman prefects of the first century are mentioned in the New Testament. Those 3 we're going to cover in as much detail as we can, with as much information as is available on those 3 men. But first of all, what I want to begin with this morning is just to give you a list of all of the prefects that governed Judea for the whole time Judea is an imperial province under Roman jurisdiction. And that would be from AD 6 to AD 66. Okay, so we're going to have 14 men. First of all, the first prefect who takes over after the banishment to Gaul of Archelaus is one Coponius, C-O-P-O-N-I-U-S. Coponius is prefect from AD 6 to AD 9. Now, what do you know about those dates there, those years? Quirinius is what? He's legate up in Syria. He happens to fit during this same period of time. That means that Coponius must have been the current prefect, Quirinius the current legate in Syria, whenever we have the taxation of AD 6, according to Acts 5:37, when Judas of Galilee revolts. Let me ask you a question about this man, considering these dates right here, AD 6 to AD 9. Is it possible that Coponius could have been in Jerusalem whenever Jesus went there as a boy of the age of 12? It is possible. Why is it possible? What year was Jesus there? Around 7, around AD 7. Okay, that fits in this time period. AD 6 to 9, AD 7 fits right in there, but these men are stationed in Caesarea, not in Jerusalem. Passover. Was it Passover? Why was Jesus going up to the temple, he and his family? In the account whenever he was 12 that Luke gives us in Luke chapter 2. Was Passover. The feast was Passover, as we read in Luke chapter 2. So no doubt the man was here. I just like to make those contacts. That doesn't mean Jesus ever saw him or he ever saw Jesus, but it's interesting to know what's going on in what periods of time. No doubt he was there. We've seen before that whenever a major feast was held, and the Roman prefects, such as Pontius Pilate, would be there in Jerusalem to quell or quench any violence or any rebellion from this rebellious group of people, according to Nehemiah and this rebellious city. So it's most likely that Coponius was not only prefect in Caesarea from AD 6 to 9, but that he would have been a temporary resident of Jerusalem in AD 7 whenever Jesus is coming to the temple. Okay, the second man is Marcus Ambivius. M-A-R-C-U-S, Marcus Ambivius. A-M-B-I-V-I-U-S. Prefect AD 9 to AD 12. Number 3, Annius Rufus. Annius. Rufus, Rufus. Prefect AD 12 to 15. Number 4, Valerius Gratus, Valerius, Valerius Gratus, Gratus, AD 15 to 26. He's one of the longer ones here, as you'll see. Number 5, probably never heard of this man, Pontius Pilate, AD 26 to 36, 11 years. AD 26 to 36. And so, conveniently enough, notice that his prefectship fits right in the time of the ministry of Christ. Number 6, Marcellus, 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 36 to 39. The next one, Marillus, Marylus, AD 39 to 41. Then you have to skip a little bit in dates. I'll tell you why later on. But if you skip a line on your page, and then we're still to the next number, number 8, the next prefect is Cuspius Fadus, Cuspius. Fadus, Fadus, prefect 44 to 46. Notice there's a gap of 3 years there. That's why you need to skip between numbers 7 and 8. These are the only prefects, though, but we'll explain why there's a skip there later on. Number 9, Tiberius Alexander. Tiberius Alexander, AD 46 to 48. Number 10, Ventidius Cumanus, Ventidus, Cumanus, Cumanus, 48 to 52. Number 11, Antonius Felix, '52 to 59. Antonius Felix. Number 12, Porcius Festus, Porcius. Porcius Festus, 59 to 62. Number 13, Albinus, 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 62 to 64. And then finally, number 14, Gessius Florus, Gessius, Gessius Florus, Florus, AD 64 to 66. Okay, you might want to star number 5, number 11, and number 12. Those will be the only 3 that we really have any information on. And of course, most of our information is going to come right from the New Testament. The Gospels, first of all, and the book of Acts. Secondly, the Gospels for Pilate and the book of Acts for Felix and Festus. So we're not going to look at Coponius or Ambivius or Rufus or Gratus, those individuals. We're just giving you that for completeness sake so that you have a complete list of who the prefects or the procurators are during this period of Israel's history, who they are and when they rule. But we will look at these 3 men, and in this order: Pontius Pilate, Antonius Felix, and Porcius Festus. Okay, this morning we're going to start with Pontius Pilate, and we'll study part of his life, and part of it we'll study in the next teaching then. Pontius Pilate, the procurator or the prefect of the most importance. It just happens to be the one that we know the most about as well. We know the most about him from several different sources in history. One Pontius Pilate. It's interesting that it's worked out this way. He happens to be, of all of these men, the most important because of the events that take place under his life. Not just biblical events, but primarily biblical events. He happens just so to be the most important, and also, thankfully enough, the one about whom we know the most, not only from the Bible, but from extra-biblical sources. To us, I'm speaking primarily for myself, and if you fit in this category, then that's fine. The name is most familiar through the years of the repeating of the Apostles' Creed. I think I knew the man through the Apostles' Creed before I ever knew that he was in God's Word. Jesus was conceived of the Holy Ghost, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. I always used to wonder, what in the world? Yeah. And who in the world? What a cruel mother to name a son Pontius Pilate. I'd never heard a name like that before. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried the third day, rose again from the dead. I believe in the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of the saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. Then, amen. That's where I was first introduced to the man Pontius Pilate. And I really didn't know. I had no idea that he was in the Bible. I had no idea what he did. I mean, it says in the Apostles' Creed that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. So I kind of put two and two together, and he's some man that did something to Jesus. But, of course, I didn't know Jesus back then. So I guess that wasn't too bad. Since I didn't know him, I certainly didn't know and shouldn't have known Pontius Pilate. Let's look, first of all, at the sources of knowledge for this man, Pontius Pilate. We've got several different sources of knowledge for the man Pontius Pilate. First of all, we have the New Testament. We'll start with that. First of all, we have the New Testament, and here's where he is found. Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 3:1. Let's look at Luke 3:1 before we go on. Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. Probably be the only time we have to look at this verse now in light of this man. Now, the historian Luke is dating the ministry of John the Baptist. The 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Pontius Pilate, Pontius Pilate, or you could call him Pontius Pilate, being governor of Judea. We know him technically as a prefect, but governor is fine. Governor of Judea. And of course we know, because of other things that we have already discussed, that his headquarters would have been in Herod's palace and Herod's hall in Caesarea. And Herod, this is another Herod, of course, being Tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, Tetrarch of Iturea in the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanias, the Tetrarch of Abilene. Then he's seen also in Luke 13:1, in John chapters 18 and 19, and two other places. Who can name the two books? Where besides Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would Pontius Pilate be found in the New Testament? Acts, okay, he's found in Acts. One other place. No? It's an unusual reference to him. Well, what, you want to take 5-minute pause here or do it over the next couple of days? Where else is Pontius Pilate found? I'm sure you've read it. Well, start guessing. You only have so many books left anyway. Romans, no. Corinthians, no. Galatians. Turn to your table of contents. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, of course. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Maybe better look at that verse. You biblical illiterates out there. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 13. I give thee charge in the sight of God, who quickeneth all things, and before Christ Jesus, who before Pontius Pilate witnessed a good confession. Confessed a good confession before Pontius Pilate. So he's found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and 1 Timothy. He's found in more places than the other two prefects, Felix and Festus, will be found. So there's our chief source of information and knowledge about the man. We are given quite a bit of information about him and just what type of person he was. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and 1 Timothy. Then secondly, we have Josephus. Josephus, Antiquities, let's see, book 18, chapter 3. All of probably the third chapter. I'm going to read a little bit of this. And then I'm going to comment about a certain, this is probably Antiquities, 18:3:3. It's probably the most famous and important place in all of Josephus' writings. Antiquities 18:3:3, and I'll show you why whenever we get there. Now I'm no scholar on Josephus' writings. There are scholars on that because there's so much information, but I have read everything that he has written, and I have it in 4 volumes. Some of you might have an abridged edition in 1 volume, or some of you may have the complete edition in 1 volume, but you have to read it with a magnifying glass, so. But here in the 3rd chapter, it's entitled Sedition of the Jews Against Pontius Pilate. And then the next statement is concerning Christ. Let's just read a little and see what we have here. But now Pilate, the procurator of Judea. Notice that term. Josephus is writing toward the end of the 1st century, the same time as Tacitus is writing. So procurator became obviously the more important of the 2 terms between procurator and prefect. The procurator of Judea removed the army from Caesarea to Jerusalem to take their winter quarters there in order to abolish the Jewish laws. So he introduced Caesar's effigies, which were upon the ensigns, and brought them into the city, whereas our law forbids us the very making of images, on which account the former procurators were wont to make their entry into the city with such ensigns as had not those ornaments. I'll explain what he's talking about here later. I don't know how much I want to read. Pilate was first who brought these images to Jerusalem and set them up there. Well, some of this seems like we're going to be getting to here in a moment. Let me jump over to this 3rd paragraph then. Now, there was about this time Jesus. Now, see, Josephus, of course, is not a Christian. He's a Jew, but he's not a Christian. He never was. And he's writing about the end of the 1st century A.D. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer, you see, because of the references to him among the Christians as being deity, divine, God. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. Well, not during his earthly ministry. He drew a few Jews and not any Gentiles, really. So probably Josephus has reference to not only him, but the people who came after him, the apostles. He was Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Well, that's a beautiful reference to Christ and to Christianity and its origins and its early beginnings. And for some people, I guess they could say it's a much needed reference as far as an extra biblical reference, because if we say we believe the Bible because we believe the Bible, then isn't that reasoning in a circle? So do we have any evidence that Jesus ever really lived? Anything besides the Bible? Obviously the Bible will tell us that he lives because the Bible wants us to believe that. But what about someone from a so-called impartial point of view? Well, Josephus would be one. And so many people have latched upon this third paragraph. But it's a highly suspicious paragraph. It's questioned among some Josephus scholars whether Josephus is the author of this at all, whether it can be found in the earliest copies that we have of Josephus. But is it not rather, and this is many people's suggestion, and I'm not getting into it now because I'm not knowledgeable enough on that, but it's an interesting suggestion. Do we not have here a later interpolation, a later addition by the Christians into the writing of Josephus to give us a good, sound, first century extra-biblical reference to him? So don't put a lot of faith if you hear anyone quoting that, well, Josephus talks about Jesus. That's highly questionable in most people's minds who have studied the writings of Josephus, whether this originally came from his pen, but rather maybe it's an addition from Christians at a later time. Okay, anyway, he goes on into, he even gives us the date. They give us here, William Whiston, remember, is the one who's given us this translation, probably the best-known translation of Josephus, when it says that Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had him condemned on the cross. They give us the date, A.D. 33, April the 3rd. And then he rose again on the third day. They have April the 5th there. Well, all of that's really pretty questionable too, particularly that A.D. 33 date. That makes him born in the year 0, you see. And then he started his ministry when he was 30, and he was crucified when he was 33, so that fits A.D. 33. Well, if he's really born back 5 B.C., then A.D. 33, of course, will not fit at all. So Josephus is another good place where we have references. Most of them true, probably all of them that Josephus made anyway, are true concerning Pontius Pilate. The thing about Jesus may not be from his pen. Okay, we're looking at sources of knowledge of Pilate. First of all, the New Testament. Secondly, Josephus. Thirdly, Philo, the Jewish writer of Alexandria. He records a summary description by Agrippa I of Pilate, which I will give you the quote of. Philo records a summary description of Pilate that was given by Agrippa I. And here's what Agrippa said. Pilate was inflexible of nature, stubborn and harsh. Now, Agrippa I is more or less a contemporary. He's actually coming on the scene around this time. And his opinion, his understanding of Pilate is that he was inflexible of nature, stubborn and harsh. Then fourthly, Tacitus, Annals 15, period 44. Tacitus in his Annals 15:44 mentions Pilate as the judge and procurator who condemned Christ to death. And that's probably a truly given account from the pen of Tacitus. Pilate was the judge and the procurator who condemned Christ to death. So there's an extra biblical reference right there to Christ. These are our only references, our only knowledge of Pontius Pilate. And then, fifthly and finally, we have some archaeological discoveries, which we'll look at now. I told you before a little about the work that was done in Caesarea in the late 1950s and early 1960s. We looked a lot at some of the discoveries and some of the buildings there before. By the way, where's Marie? Marie said to call her whenever the pictures were on. I doubt she meant for me to do it that way. But we might as well be open and honest. Come on down, Marie, wherever you are. That's what she gets for asking. I never intend, well, wait a minute. Sometimes I do intend to embarrass people, but embarrass them in the good sense. It's never because I lack tact. I do it on purpose, that's for sure. Keeps us all on the same level, I guess. In 1961, at this place, Caesarea, a very important discovery was made that I told you we would look at in the future, which now the present is the future. Okay, we looked at Caesarea before. Remember how we saw, I should have brought some of those earlier slides maybe to introduce you to all of that. Remember the Roman theater there that we saw and the harbor, how it was built? You remember all of that? Well, what we also have here in the same place is a lot of Crusader remains. The Crusaders came and built upon some of the work that was done by Herod the Great way back in BC years, remember. Herod the Great was the one who had done all of this. So I'm just showing you some pictures before I come to the final. It's just one small thing, but it's of crucial importance. It's invaluable as far as archaeological inscriptions and discoveries are concerned. What we have here are the walls of a Crusader fortress that's built around the whole confines of those earlier slides that we looked at where we saw the harbor of Caesarea. We saw some of the fallen columns of some buildings there. He had to have his palace somewhere around there, and chiefly where we saw that outdoor theater where the Israelis are still performing there. They've installed lights. Remember all of that now. So all of that, in other words, is on the other side of this picture. This must be looking then toward the west. On the other side of this would be all of the work done by Herod the Great, and then all on the other side of that would be the Mediterranean Sea. This all here is Crusader fortress, and around this wall, at its foot, all the way around, was a huge moat.
For the continuing,
all of this wall here is Crusader fortress, and around this wall, at its foot, all the way around, was a huge moat. Look how perfectly preserved that is. We went across right here. I took this picture. We walked across on a drawbridge that went into the castle. This is a Crusader castle. This was not done by Herod the Great. It was so interesting to see the joints in the wall where all of the bars went to hold the doors intact, and there'd be double or triple doors there and double and triple bars there to keep people out, and then there were places where they would roll the drawbridge that would come up. You can see, you put this back in focus, you can see how much water this would hold. I mean, that must be like maybe 15 feet down or something. And, of course, you'd throw a crocodile or two in there, I guess. Even if you don't, it'd be difficult to get across that and go up these walls. They're at an angle like this, as you can see, these walls that lead up there. But I thought that was interesting because it's such a perfect preservation of something about 1,000 years old. But anyway, you go in. What I showed you earlier, here's the gate. If we go in right here, what I showed you earlier was a wall way down on this side. And just as you go in the gate and you go through the inner courts, you see all of this. This also is Crusader work here. This is not done by Herod the Great, so it doesn't date back to those times. Where's the Roman theater and the harbor and all of this? It's over here to the left. But you can see we're just on the other side of the walls now. We're looking at this work done by the Crusaders, and the Mediterranean Sea is on the other side. Okay, they do not keep it here anymore. It's kept, I believe, in Jerusalem. But they have a replica, and it seemed to me it was up closer, but this may be it, or this may be it. They've moved it around several different times. I'm going to show you a picture of what one of these things is here in a moment. It'll be in another place, but I just remember whenever we walked in, it was right in front of us. I thought it was up here, but one of these things may be a replica of this, which reads Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Now that is the first and the only, and archaeological discoveries are so important because, I mean, there it is. It's not like Tacitus could have lied or something. Here it actually is. A reference to Pontius Pilate, our most definite, even beyond the Bible we could say, because maybe someone slipped this in. Maybe it's a textual variant here every time Pontius Pilate is mentioned in the Bible. Here's our most definite reference to Pontius Pilate. You can't see all the writing. It goes down beneath this. And here it's kept in another place. But the real thing, I think, is back at Jerusalem. They keep a replica. You can't sit out there in all the storms and rain and sunshine, or it's just going to eventually disintegrate. This was found in 1961 at Caesarea. So how do we know that Pontius Pilate, that we've repeated that name probably hundreds of times in the Apostles' Creed, ever really lived? Well, here's one of our best proofs right here. An inscription has been discovered that dates right from the time of Pontius Pilate, A.D. 26 to A.D. 36. That's me right there. No, not really. Okay, we can have all the lights back on. That's all we have for those slides. I just wanted to lead up to that one inscription that we have. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Okay, there are our sources of knowledge about Pontius Pilate. Then I've got the rest of his life divided up into pre-Passion history and Pilate and the Passion. So this morning all we're going to have time to cover, all I want to cover, is pre-Passion history. We're giving you in these studies all the information that we know that's available at this time, just in a succinct form about these various individuals which we are discussing. So we'll first of all this morning look at pre-Passion history. Then the next time we teach on the intertestamental period, we'll get into the Gospels a whole lot and read a lot of the accounts there. And that may take us a little time, maybe a little slow, but we'll take the time to read some of the accounts, much of the accounts of what's going on in the trial and the Passion of Christ, just so you can see the character of Pilate brought forth. And you can decide then whether or not that's in agreement with some of these other statements made about him, like he was stubborn, he was harsh, and he was inflexible of nature. Okay, I've got a couple of things here so we're really under point 2 about Pilate. First of all, we looked at sources of knowledge. Secondly, we look at pre-Passion history. Then we'll have several points under this. Pilate had the penchant of always offending the Jews, and many times on purpose. Let's look at the first of several occasions, some of which are recorded, maybe most of which are now lost. Here's the first time that we have recorded something taking place with Pilate where he's got this proclivity to offend the Jews, and many times he seems to do it on purpose. Military standards were brought into Jerusalem by night one time, and on these military standards the emperor's image could be seen on the crossbars. You know what a standard is? It's like a rallying flag, in a marching band, or for the old soldiers in the West or something to hold up a flag and you'd rally around that. If you remember back in the Old Testament, the 4 different divisions of the people, as they moved, they had standards that represented that group of the 3 tribes of Israel. And there'd be 3 tribes here, 3 there, and 3 there to make up the 12 tribes of Israel. They had certain standards, and of course much guesswork has gone into, well, what was on those standards? A lion, a bear, a leopard, an eagle. Well, isn't that where Ezekiel gets his image of the cherubim and the living creatures over there in Ezekiel chapter 1, and a lot of ideas like that. But anyway, there'd be some type of picture or writing or image, or it'd be made out of a certain color like crimson or yellow or blue, so that people, your armies all around you, as you would hold that thing up, could see you, and they would all rally together there. Like whenever we were over in Israel, we didn't have a standard like that, but the man who led us around, you just get lost when you've got 30 or 40 people there, and you're all wandering all over the place, and so his cry to us was angels. Whenever he yelled at the top of his voice, angels, then everyone would come rallying to where that voice was, because you might be down the street and around the corner and in a butcher shop somewhere. Whenever you'd hear that cry, angels, and you'd hear other people yelling, hippopotamus, and then everyone would rally in that little group together. And sometimes some of the people did have little things they would hold up, for people all around to see. Some of these, they had these extended sticks or poles where it'd fold up about a foot long, and you'd pull that whole thing out and hold it up way high and wave a flag on top of it or something. So that's the purpose. All of that, I guess, fits in the same category. Now the Jews can say, well, what's the problem with that? And by the way, this is what we were reading over here in Josephus. I got into that. He brought in things with ensigns, brought them into the city, whereas our law forbids us the very making of images, on which account the former procurators were wont to make their entry into the city with such ensigns as had not those ornaments. In other words, the former prefects, those prior to the time of Pontius Pilate, observed the religious scruples of the Jews. And they would bring in their standards or their ensigns, but make sure that the emperor's image was not on that, because that was a great offense to the Jews and their superstition to make any type of image. Now, that really wasn't based on the Old Testament. It was falsely based there. God said, don't make any image of me. But he didn't say you couldn't have a picture of an antelope drawn on your wall or a picture of Caesar or something like that. And that was one of the big problems with the coins for the people. Remember what Jesus asked? Whose image and superscription? It's Caesar's on there. That caused the people nothing but turmoil and trouble. To use money and to pay with money and to buy with money that had a pagan image upon it. So anyway, they were kind of hyper-literalist and legalist in that area, and that caused them a lot of problems. So that's the problem here. That's why we're stressing this. The Jews sent a delegation up to Caesarea to appeal the case before Pontius Pilate. He evidently did this on purpose, sent his men into Jerusalem on one occasion with the standards of the Roman army carried about, and upon those the image of Caesar. We even have here, which was done without the knowledge of the people, because it was done in the nighttime. But as soon as they knew it, they came in multitudes to Caesarea and interceded with Pilate many days. This is in Antiquities 18:3-1. I'm just kind of summing all of this up for you. They stand before Pilate for 5 days, waiting for him to come and see them, evidently in the judgment hall there, and present their case before him. And the reason he doesn't come, obviously, is to make them the more mad and the more angry. The 6th day, he finally steps out and has all of the Jewish delegates surrounded by his Roman soldiers. And he promised them immediate death if they did not cease these religious scruples and Old Testament quarrels that they had with the image of Caesar. So, how did the Jews respond? Like the Jews of many days, they fell to the floor, took off their turban, rolled down their tunic they had on, and bared their neck and said, well, then cut our heads off. They were willing to die. Well, that changed Pilate's mind. He didn't want to make a bloody mess on his spick-and-span floor, I guess, so he let the people go, sent them back home, and that's probably what you get in the conclusion here. They threw themselves upon the ground, laid bare their necks, said they'd take death very willingly rather than the wisdom of their law should be transgressed. On which Pilate was deeply affected with their firm resolution to keep their laws inviolable, and presently commanded the images to be carried back from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So you see, we're leading up to the Passion account here. He has many, many run-ins with the Jewish people. And so that's going to be interesting in discussing the psychology of what's going on between Pontius Pilate and the high priests, the religious leaders, whenever they're crying out, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate, remember, says he's not guilty. But then eventually Pilate goes over to their side. Why? I mean, he didn't, in a sense, owe anything to the people. He kind of enjoyed tormenting the people. He kind of enjoyed that. So why not let Jesus go, knowing how much that would torment the Jewish leaders there? But we know that he doesn't. Okay, a second case of offense between Pilate and the Jews. He fixed golden shields with the emperor's name on the walls of his Jerusalem palace. And, of course, they don't like this at all, to say the least. So as a result, the Jews petition Tiberius Caesar directly himself. And remember, the Romans, the wise Romans, for the most part, were very conscientious of not offending the religious, and if they could help it, the political scruples of the people over whom they ruled, because they knew that in doing that, you're only going to bring upon yourselves further problems. So the best thing to do is accommodate yourself. as much as possible, the Roman army, the Roman people, the Roman leaders, the Roman government, the Roman Empire itself. Accommodate yourself as much as possible. Station military garrisons there to keep the peace if necessary, but accommodate yourself as much as possible to those people, to their laws, to their customs, to their traditions, and they'll make better subjects for you. That was very wise to do that. A lot of people you see, a lot of leaders and empires of the past just go in and run over everything, destroy the temples and kill the priests. Well, what's that going to do for the people? They're going to rise up and revolt, is what they're going to do. Of course, the Jews do anyway, but it takes at least a period of time before they do. The case is decided before Tiberius, and he decides in favor of the Jews. They win both of these cases then. These golden shields fastened to the walls of the Jerusalem palace formerly belonged to Herod. Now, of course, Pontius Pilate uses it as a temporary residence whenever he's in Jerusalem. Were with the emperor's name on them, were taken down. Okay, then a third pre-passion reference we have to the man is in Luke chapter 13 and verse 1. We've already looked at Luke 3:1, which is just a reference to him by name. Here's a reference to him by incident. Luke 13:1. See if you don't remember us having looked at this earlier. There were present at that season some that told him, Jesus, of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Remember over in the end of Luke's Gospel in chapter 23 talks about Herod and Pilate being made friends from that day whenever Jesus was sent to both of them, because prior to that time they were enemies. And we ask ourselves the question, why were they enemies prior to that time? And we answered that by saying, well, definitely no one knows the answer. That is, no one knows definitely the answer why they were enemies. But Luke 13:1 is a good suggestion. Herod was in control of Galilee at that time, remember. So the people there were Galileans. Pontius Pilate had jurisdiction over Judea, stationed at Caesarea, but he had jurisdiction over Judea, which includes Jerusalem, which is where the sacrifices would be offered. Therefore, it's a good suggestion, it's a strong possibility that there was enmity between these two men, Herod Antipas and Pontius Pilate, because for some reason, what that reason is we don't know, Pilate murdered some Galileans who were subjects to Herod Antipas and not to Pontius Pilate whenever they'd come down to Jerusalem and Judea on some occasion to offer sacrifice. There were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans. Pontius Pilate's ruling from AD 26 to 36. So this must have just taken place here. Whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. You can see what an atrocious event we must have here when these Galileans are making the journey up to Jerusalem, as these religious, spiritual people should at that time, making their journey up there to offer their sacrifices in Jerusalem, and their blood, because Pilate has them murdered, is mingled with the blood of their sacrifices. Jesus answering said unto them, Suppose ye that these Galileans were sinners above all the Galileans because they suffered such things? You can really get a sermon and a message out of this. And what Jesus is saying is just because someone here in this life suffers some great tragedy, that doesn't mean they're any more of a sinner than those people who seemingly escape unscathed while they're in this life. He said, do you suppose they're sinners more than other Galileans who were not murdered by Pilate? Here's his answer in verse 3. I tell you, no. But except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. And he has reference to eventual and eternal perishing there. Because that was a popular thought to the Jews. Remember in John 9, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That they traced everything back to some sin that someone had committed. That's the same idea right here. Was it some great sin that caused these Galileans to be murdered down there? No. Jesus just said it's your whole sinful life that causes that to happen. And sometimes it might happen in this life where you go through some atrocious event like this, and sometime your atrocities may be spared for the future. I tell you, nay, but except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. He goes on to give us another example of the Tower of Siloam that fell and killed 18 people. We think, well, what did those 18 people do wrong? No more than the 18 who stood by and watched whenever the tower fell, is Jesus' opinion. He said, you've all sinned, and you'll all perish, except you all repent. So there's another place where he's found. We really know nothing more about this event than what we have in Luke 13. Then fourthly and finally, this is all we're going to look at here this morning. We'll probably finish a little early. Fourthly and finally, pre-passion events of Herod was the aqueduct that he built. This is even mentioned in Antiquities 18:3-2. So I'll kind of summarize that and give you a history of that. Pilate built an aqueduct from the southern highlands to supply the city of Jerusalem with more water. Tremendous event to be accomplished. Now as well as then, but probably then much more than now. And in order to finance this, he took money from the temple treasury. Holy offerings that have been given by the Jews. Now, there's a good explanation. Let me just draw you what this kind of looks like here. Why he thought that he was justified in doing this. We have Jerusalem here. Then we've got the southern highlands over here. There were springs that were found here. Those are highlands there. As you go in a westward direction, of course, you end up with the plains, low-lying areas. But as you go toward the western shore of the sea, the Dead Sea, then you end up in the highlands. He felt that the temple benefited greatly with all of its washings, all of its ceremonial washings. It had to have lots of water to conduct all of that. And he felt that the temple itself would benefit greatly from the new aqueduct that he was building, which is precisely correct. But the leaders, the Jewish leaders, were infuriated nevertheless. Probably Pilate was right here. He built the aqueduct, the Jewish liturgy, the Jewish priests, the Jewish people, everyone who came down. You had to bathe yourself or bathe the animal and clean yourself or clean the animal and clean pots and pans. And just think of it's hard to imagine how much water would be necessary in the precincts of the temple in order to accomplish all of that. And he very justifiably reasons then, well, since you're going to be benefiting from this so greatly, why not footing the bill, or at least part of the bill? So he does take a little money out of the temple treasury by force, and they're just infuriated over this, and so they start a riot. We don't know exactly when this is, but they start a riot in Jerusalem. It may be taking place, though, during the life of Christ. Though, of course, it could be after him, because he rules all the way to AD 36. But it's possible that it could be taking place during the time of Christ. If it does, by the way, we don't have any reference to this in the Gospels. So, Pilate sends soldiers into the Jewish crowd disguised as private citizens with concealed daggers. And a whole melee breaks forth, and many of the Jews are killed by Pilate's soldiers that are sent into their midst as private citizens.